From the outside, people always assumed my sister Naira and I were close. Two daughters growing up in the same house, sharing the same parents, school memories, and family dinners. But the truth looked very different once you stepped inside our walls. Because Naira wasn't just an older sister. She was the golden child, the center of gravity in our house, the star my parents built their world around, while I was the afterthought, the occasional responsibility they remembered only when convenient. And for years, I tried to ignore it, telling myself these things happen in families, that favoritism doesn't always come from cruelty, but from habit. But everything changed the night our relatives visited and casually asked, "Which one is older?" And without hesitation, my mother smiled brightly at Naira and introduced her as the mature, responsible eldest daughter, while her eyes flicked toward me with that familiar warning: don't laugh, don't react, don't ruin the perfect image she wants to show the world. And when a small, awkward laugh escaped me anyway, I could already sense the storm brewing behind my mother's polite smile and Naira's tightening posture. Because in my home, even my smile was treated like rebellion. And later that night, when the guests left and the house grew quiet, I heard Naira walking toward my room with the slow, deliberate steps she always used when she wanted to intimidate, without looking like she was trying. And she entered with a perfectly calm face, sat on my bed, and stared at me like she was studying a problem only she had the right to solve. Then slowly pushed a neatly wrapped gift toward me and said, "Maybe this will help you." And inside the box lay a thick book titled "How Not to Be a Middle Child Failure," with a sticky note that read, "Because someone needs guidance." And for a moment, I couldn't breathe, not because of the insult, but because of the casual confidence with which she delivered it, as if her cruelty wasn't cruelty at all, but wisdom, as if humiliating me was her responsibility as the better sister. And when I asked if it was some kind of joke, she shrugged and said, "Stop taking everything personally. Try improving yourself for once." Then left the room with that signature smirk that told me she believed she had done me a favor. But what she didn't know was that this was the first thread in a web I had never fully seen before. And the next morning, the web spread wider when Dad casually asked about job applications I had sent out. The 17 applications I had triple-checked, printed, stamped, and mailed with hope. And when he asked if I'd received any replies, something in me tightened because I hadn't received a single email, not one. And as I walked into the kitchen, my eyes fell on an empty envelope on the counter, my handwriting, my address to an HR department. But the envelope had never been sent. And when I asked how it got there, Mom breezily said, "Maybe I misplaced it." And Naira walked in right on cue, laughing in that light, condescending way she had perfected, saying, "Still blaming others for your mistakes? Grow up." For the first time, my stomach twisted with a suspicion I didn't want to admit. But later that night, when I went downstairs for water and noticed the storage room door was slightly open with a faint light glowing inside, curiosity pulled me toward it. And what I found inside froze me in place. A full carton stuffed with my job applications, the documents I thought I mailed, photocopies of my certificates, envelopes sealed but never sent, all stacked and hidden like trash. And on the top lay a label written in Naira's handwriting: "Don't let her ruin her own chances." For a full 10 seconds, I couldn't even move, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were showing me. And then I heard her voice behind me, calm and sharp at the same time. "Looking for something?" And she stood at the doorway with arms folded, wearing that coldly satisfied expression. And when I asked why she did this, she didn't deny it, didn't panic, didn't even bother to pretend innocence. Instead, she said, "Because the moment you get out there, people start comparing us.
I'm perfect as long as you stay in the background. If you rise, the balance breaks. And when she said that, something inside me cracked because it meant her jealousy wasn't random. It was planned, calculated, and months old. And I noticed then that in her hand was the duplicate key to my phone drawer, which meant she had been going through my things, monitoring, deleting, rearranging, deciding what opportunities I deserved to receive and which ones she would erase before they reached me. And when the next morning, before I could process any of this, my mother called me downstairs excitedly as if some great blessing had appeared. And when I reached the living room, they were all gathered around Naira, celebrating because she had been selected as a brand ambassador for an influencer agency, something that seemed to validate every belief she had about being special and destined. And my parents showered her with praise. "You make us proud. You're going to achieve so much. You're the kind of daughter every parent wants." And as I stood there, absorbing all the affection they had never directed at me, Naira turned to me and with the sweetest, fakest smile said, "Don't worry, sis. You'll do something someday." And that sentence, wrapped in kindness but built entirely of condescension, hit me harder than anything she had done before, because it wasn't pity. It was a declaration that I was beneath her, that I belonged lower, that she expected me to stay there. And that night, when my professor texted asking why I never attended the interview for a company that had shortlisted me, my entire world tilted. He told me the company had called me twice, and someone had answered saying I wasn't interested. And when I checked my call logs, the outgoing calls were deleted, clean, specific, intentional. And suddenly everything aligned. The missing emails, the lost envelopes, the deleted logs, the subtle jabs, the fake gifts, the manipulation disguised as guidance. And it became clear that Naira hadn't just been competing with me. She had been quietly dismantling my life step by step, controlling my progress, shaping my failures, keeping me constructively helpless so her brilliance could shine brighter in comparison. And as I stood in front of my mirror that night, staring directly into my own eyes, I felt something unfamiliar rising within me, a kind of silence that wasn't weakness anymore, but clarity, a deep, cold certainty that this chapter of being the background character in my own life was over. And in that quiet room, with the faint sound of Naira laughing downstairs as if she owned the entire house, I whispered to myself, "Enough." Because this wasn't just sibling jealousy. It was a slow, psychological crisis I had ignored for too long. And now that I had seen the truth with my own eyes, there was no going back, no pretending, no forgiving the sabotage she justified as protecting the balance. And I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, or how, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The next part of the story wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about reclaiming everything she stole from me, piece by piece, opportunity by opportunity. And while she believed she had already won, she didn't realize the only reason she ever succeeded was because I never fought back. But now, for the first time in my life, I was ready to step out of the shadow she built around me. And part one ends with me standing in front of that mirror, looking directly into my own eyes, realizing that the girl staring at me wasn't broken. She was awakening. The morning after I whispered enough to my reflection, something in the air felt different. Not because anything had changed on the outside. Naira was still humming in the bathroom while doing her hair. Dad was still sipping tea while scrolling through news. Mom was still inspecting the house like every surface existed to impress someone. But because inside me, a quiet shift had taken place, a new clarity settling into my bones. And while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to scroll through my phone, I secretly replayed the night before. The storage room, the stolen envelopes, the deleted call logs, the smugness in Naira's eyes. And instead of crying or confronting her, I did something she never expected. I observed her, really observed her.
The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she tried to control narratives with practiced innocence. And for the first time, I realized how predictable she was, how methodical her sabotage had been, because her entire persona relied on two things: my silence and my failure. And if either of those disappeared, her carefully curated superiority would collapse like a tower built on wet sand. So when she sat across from me at breakfast and casually asked if I wanted her help rewriting my resume, claiming she had connections that could make my life easier, I looked up and smiled. A calm smile she wasn't prepared for, one that made her expression flicker with confusion. And I replied, "No thanks, I've already fixed everything." And her eyebrows twitched, barely noticeable to someone who hadn't studied her for years. But I saw it. That tiny crack in her mask, and it was the first drop of power returning to me. But I didn't say more. Not yet. Because while she had spent months undermining me in the shadows, I was going to rebuild myself in the open. Not through wild announcements, but quiet action. The kind that grows roots before anyone notices. And later that afternoon, when she left for a photo shoot at the agency that had chosen her, I sat at my desk and reopened the files she had hidden. The job listings, the drafts, the certificates. And instead of feeling defeated by how much time I had lost, I felt something sharper: purpose. And I began emailing every contact I could find, explaining the situation without using her name, requesting second chances, reapplying everywhere she had blocked me from. And something unexpected happened. People replied, quickly, kindly, offering slots, rescheduling interviews, sending test tasks, and my inbox, which had once felt like an empty hallway, now buzzed with possibility. And while I was working, my professor sent another message. "They liked your profile. If you can do the test assignment tonight, I can still get you into the interview pool." And without hesitation, I accepted, pouring hours into the assignment, editing until my fingers hurt, because this time, no one would delete my work or intercept my future. And when I finally submitted it, exhausted but proud, I walked downstairs for water and heard Mom talking to someone on the phone, saying, "Naira is incredible, always hardworking, always successful. I don't know where she gets that discipline from. Her sister tries, but she's just different." And even though the usual sting hit me, it faded faster than before, replaced by something sturdier, because I suddenly understood the truth. My family's version of me wasn't based on who I was, but on the version Naira carefully curated for them. The helpless sister, the unskilled one, the one who always needed rescuing or correcting. And I whispered to myself, "Not anymore," and went back upstairs to continue building my new life behind the thin walls of a house that believed nothing would ever change. And the universe must have sensed the shift, because the next morning, I woke up to an email from one of the companies saying, "Your assignment was the strongest of the batch. We'd like to invite you for an interview tomorrow." And I read it twice, then a third time, my heart pounding. And for a moment, I imagined telling Naira, imagine watching her expression when she realized I had gotten something without her involvement. But I stopped myself. This wasn't about her. Not yet. This was about reclaiming my life first. And so I got ready quietly, rehearsed answers. And when the day arrived, I left for the interview without saying a word to anyone, because silence was my new shield. And the interview went better than I could have dreamed. They were impressed. Genuinely impressed. The kind of impressed that doesn't depend on connections or last names or curated reputations. And on my way home, I stopped by a small cafe, sipping a drink while staring out the window, realizing that this was what freedom tasted like. Not dramatic, not loud, just clean and steady. And I smiled without forcing it, a real smile, the kind I hadn't felt in months. Maybe years. But that evening, when I walked into the house with hope tucked safely inside me, Naira was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes sharp, like she had sensed something in the air. And she asked, "Where were you?" with a tone that wasn't curiosity, but ownership. And for the first time, I didn't shrink back. I simply said, "Out," and walked past her. And I felt, rather than saw, the shock in her silence, because I had never denied her a full explanation before. And over the next few days, little things began exposing her insecurity, her constant questions about whether I needed help, her fake concern when she peeked into my room, her sudden attempts to be supportive. But beneath each gesture was a tremor of fear. And one night I overheard her telling Mom, "She's acting strange. Keep an eye on her," as if I were a malfunctioning device she needed to inspect. And I almost laughed, because she didn't realize I already knew her patterns, her fears, her weaknesses. And I wasn't playing the role she scripted for me anymore. And then the turning point arrived one afternoon when I received a call from the company. They were offering me the position, a role that would set the foundation of a career Naira could no longer sabotage. And I wanted to celebrate, to scream, to tell the world. But instead, I took a deep breath and simply said, "Thank you, I accept," and closed my laptop quietly, holding the moment close, like a secret victory. But fate had another twist waiting for me, because as I walked downstairs for dinner, the house felt strangely tense, the air tight. And when I reached the dining room, Naira was sitting stiffly, her phone on the table, screen turned face down, a sign she had been crying, something I had rarely seen. And when Mom asked her what was wrong, she explained in a trembling voice that the agency had dropped her from the ambassador program, claiming her attitude was difficult and unprofessional behavior had been reported. And while Mom panicked and Dad tried to comfort her, Naira's eyes lifted to mine with a mix of suspicion and desperation, searching for proof that I had something to do with it. But I didn't. I hadn't contacted the agency, hadn't sabotaged her the way she sabotaged me, hadn't exposed anything about her, because I wasn't becoming her. I was becoming myself. And maybe that's why her downfall disturbed the entire house more than anything I had ever struggled through, because for the first time in her life, Naira wasn't the flawless one, the chosen one, the one who everything revolved around. And the balance she protected so fiercely began to crumble on its own, without my intervention. And that night, while she locked herself in her room and Mom walked around angrily, blaming jealous coworkers or haters, I sat on my bed and realized something profound. Naira's identity relied on external validation, while mine had shifted toward internal strength. And without meaning to, the universe had simply aligned itself to reveal the truth she spent years hiding. Not my failure, but her fragility. And part 2 ends here, with me lying awake in the darkness, hearing Naira crying softly in the next room, and realizing that the sister who once felt invincible had finally discovered what it feels like to stand in a space where admiration doesn't automatically follow her. And while I felt no joy in her pain, I also felt no obligation to shrink back into the shadow she built, because the story was shifting, the power was shifting, and for the first time in years, the ground beneath us wasn't hers. It was leveling.
I barely slept that night, not because of guilt or excitement, but because something inside me felt unsettled, like the story of our lives had been running on a crooked track for years and was finally beginning to straighten. And when morning came, the house was silent in a way it had never been before, the kind of silence that carries tension instead of peace. And when I stepped into the hallway, Naira's door was still closed, her lights still off, her perfect world still fractured from the night before. But I didn't linger. I had my first day at my new job, the job she tried so hard to prevent me from getting. And as I got ready, I felt something deeper than pride rising inside me, something steady, calm, and unshakable, a feeling that didn't depend on anyone's approval.
And when I walked downstairs, Dad looked up in surprise because he wasn't used to seeing me dressed with purpose. And Mom asked absent-mindedly if I could pick up groceries later, not even noticing that I was holding a work bag until I said, "I can't. I start my new job today." And the shock that flickered across her face would have hurt me months ago, but now it only clarified how deeply they had underestimated me. And after a moment, Dad smiled, a small, genuine smile, the first one directed at me in a long time, maybe because he finally saw something he couldn't ignore, while Mom, still clinging to old beliefs, said something like, "Already? But you just applied." And I simply nodded, letting her own disbelief answer her. And I walked out of the door while she was still processing the fact that the daughter she thought of as less capable had quietly built something real. The first day at work felt surreal, not because the job was extraordinary, but because I was experiencing a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed. Confident, competent, focused. And every time I completed a task or someone complimented my work, I felt a thread tying me more firmly to the person I was becoming, not the version shaped by comparison or overshadowed by my sister's curated excellence. And by the end of the day, I had already been assigned to a major project, something that would have taken weeks or months in another setting. And while I stayed late finishing files, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Missed calls from Mom, 2 messages from Naira, one from Dad asking when I would be home. But I let them sit unanswered, not out of spite, but because, for the first time in years, my time belonged to me. When I finally got home, the house was dim except for the living room lamp, where the 3 of them sat waiting like a panel. And as soon as I stepped inside, Naira stood up, eyes swollen, hair messy, her usual flawless mask gone. And she asked in a trembling voice, "Did you do something? Did you talk to the agency? Did you tell them something about me?" And I blinked, stunned not by the accusation, but by the desperation behind it. Because for the first time, she was facing consequences she didn't control. And I said calmly, "No, I didn't contact anyone about you." And she stared at me long enough to know I was telling the truth, but instead of relief, her expression twisted in confusion. Because if I wasn't responsible for the collapse of her project, then the world wasn't revolving around her as much as she believed. And that idea terrified her. Mom tried to interrupt, asking why I hadn't answered their calls, and I quietly explained that I had been busy on my first day at work. And then Dad, who had been silent, asked gently, "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" And I wanted to say, because no one ever listened. But instead I simply replied, because I needed to stand on my own this time. And he nodded, understanding in a way I didn't expect, while Mom looked between us, clearly unsettled that the dynamics she depended on were shifting. But before anyone could speak again, Naira suddenly whispered, "I don't get it. You weren't supposed to be ahead of me." And the room froze because she had said the quiet part out loud, the truth she never intended to reveal, the truth she spent years hiding behind fake support and gentle sabotage. And the worst part was that she didn't even realize how cruel it sounded. She genuinely believed it. Instead of arguing, I asked her something she didn't see coming. "Why did you delete my interviews? Why did you hide my emails?" And she stiffened, her eyes widening with panic, because she didn't know I had discovered her secrets. And she stuttered something like, I didn't, what are you talking about?" But her voice cracked in the middle, betraying her. And Dad looked at her sharply, while Mom froze with her mouth slightly open, because even without proof, Naira's reaction said everything. And I didn't want to drag the truth out of her like some dramatic courtroom scene. So I simply said, "You didn't need to sabotage me. I was never competing with you." And when I said those words, something inside her shattered visibly, because her entire identity was built on the belief that she had to be superior to me in order to be valuable. And now, that belief was dissolving in front of all of us. She sank into the sofa, covering her face, crying in a way I never seen. Not pretty tears, not dramatic sobs, but raw, panicked breakdown tears. The kind that come when a lifetime of insecurity collapses under its own weight. And strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad, because I finally understood that her jealousy wasn't born out of hatred, but out of fear.
A fear she carried quietly while projecting perfection to everyone around her. A fear that whispered constantly that if I ever stood tall, she would no longer shine. And it wasn't my responsibility to fix that fear, but it made sense now. Mom tried to comfort her, but Naira pushed her hand away, saying, "Don't pretend you didn't encourage this. You always compared us." And Mom froze again because the truth was brutal, and Dad rubbed his forehead as if decades of imbalance were suddenly crowding the room. And while they argued softly, Naira whispered something only I heard. "I didn't know how to exist next to you without trying to win." And that sentence sat in the air like a confession, one I didn't know how to respond to. So I simply said, "Then learn," and walked upstairs, leaving them in a silence filled with truths they had avoided for too long. Over the next few weeks, the house changed in small but significant ways. Mom stopped using comparisons as casual filler in conversations. Dad started knocking on my door more often to ask about work, and Naira, once the untouchable star of the family, became quiet, reflective, carrying a softness I had never seen. Not weakness, but humility. The kind that grows only after everything collapses and you start rebuilding from the ground up. She apologized one evening, not in a dramatic scene, but in a fragile, honest way, sitting at the edge of my bed, twisting her fingers, saying, "I'm sorry for everything I did." And although the apology didn't erase the past, it planted something new, something real, something that was finally free of rivalry. And I accepted it not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. And as I continued to grow in my job, gaining promotions, earning respect, building a life outside the shadow of sibling comparison, I realized something powerful. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like rising in full view of the person who tried to hold you down. Not to hurt them, but to show them that their fear never had the power to define you. And in the end, the real victory wasn't that I succeeded while Naira struggled. It was that I finally stepped into my own life, my own identity, my own worth, and discovered that the person I was becoming had been waiting for me all along.